All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Amanda Wallmeyer, and I am the local history librarian here at Johnson County Library. Thank you all for attending today's Meet the Author program with Celeste Headlee. We would also like to begin today with a brief land acknowledgement. Our Kansas City institutions stand on the ancestral and treaty lands of Native American peoples at the juncture of the Missouri and Kansas rivers. In recent years, these nations have included the Delaware, Kansas, Missouri, Oto, Osage, and Shawnee. We pay respects to all Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, for their continuing presence in this land and the land where you may be joining us from tonight. Our speaker tonight is Celeste Headlee, an internationally recognized journalist and radio host, professional speaker, and author of multiple best-selling books, including We Need to Talk: How to Have Conversations That Matter. She is a regular guest host on NPR and American Public Media and hosts Newsweek's Debate podcast, a podcast for the National Gallery of Art called Sound Thoughts on Art, and the Women Amplified podcast from the Conferences for Women. Celeste is also the president and CEO of Headway DEI, and she serves on the board for the National Center for Race Amity. Celeste is the granddaughter of composer William Grant Still, known as the Dean of Black American Composers, and is a trained operatic soprano. Now, please join me in welcoming Celeste Headlee.
Hello there. It's a real pleasure to be with you this evening. I'm going to talk for about a half hour. I can talk for longer if there aren't any questions, but I usually get a lot of questions every time I do speeches. So it is a pure pleasure to speak with you this evening. I have three mass market books. I say that because one of them is specifically for broadcasters. The first one was We Need to Talk. The second one was Do Nothing, which is about the cult of productivity, the addiction of productivity. And the third one, which came out just last year, is called Speaking of Race. And I start by mentioning that because a lot of people say, oh, you've written 3 different books on 3 different topics. It's super common that people say that. And I don't think I have. I say that because my first book was all about our need for connection and how to get through a conversation that's that moves us, that connects us, that creates empathic bonds between the two of us, even if it's a brief chat. The second book about being addicted to productivity is also about connections. It's on how we have sort of placed our priorities on the wrong things. And by wrong, I mean things that are unhealthy, things that don't contribute to our well-being and make us lonelier. And that's our work. Our work has become our identity, especially in the United States. It's one of the first questions that we ask: what do you do? And that has pulled us away from the things that actually make a human being, a Homo sapiens, healthier and happier. And that is the human connections between us. One of the things I really like to emphasize is our evolutionary connection to social interaction, because I think we forget, if some of us ever knew, that the quality that actually helped Homo sapiens to survive was not advanced intelligence. I know a lot of people like to think that. It was communication and collaboration. For a very, very long time, evolutionary biologists and psychologists were trying to figure out how it was that Homo sapiens was the human species that survived, because we're fragile. We're not particularly fast. We don't have a thick hide. If you change the temperature 10 degrees, it causes us discomfort. We don't have always the best eyesight. We don't have claws. We don't have talons. So it didn't make a lot of sense that Homo sapiens would thrive on the planet. And what they discovered after a very long decades of study was that the reason that our species, has survived is our ability to communicate at the most sophisticated level of any species on the planet. And what that means is that we never do anything alone. We don't have to. It means our superpower, our evolutionary superpower, is collaboration. It means that if you are messing with one human being, you are almost always messing with more. It means a tiger can't come to your village night after night after night and drag another person out of their hut. It means that we work together to do things that other species can't. For example, there's only two species that regularly take down a bison. I don't know if you've ever seen a bison, but they're very impressive animals. They can jump 6 feet straight into the air. They can run incredibly fast. They're impressive animals. The two species that can regularly take them down are wolves and humans. And the thing that wolves and humans have in common is that we are pack animals. We work together. That means if human beings need to take out an animal like not just a bison, but an elephant or anything else, a whale, we find out who has the best aim with the spear, who's best on a horseback, who has geometric thinking that can peel one animal off from the rest, who knows how to butcher a bison. That's incredibly sophisticated communication and collaboration. It means we're relying on one another to have special talents and gifts. I may not be great on a horse, but John is. I may not be able to throw a spear very hard, but Michael can. So that is what has helped us to survive, is our hive mind, our ability to let others be good at things that we're not good at. And when I got to Do Nothing, which was the second book about toxic productivity and overwork and just the general feeling of being overwhelmed, which is for many of us with us all the time, this is sort of what I came back down to, these very basic lessons of how human beings work, how we function, what we do well, what we need, what are our inherent needs, and what are the things we can do without. And then I got to the third book, and that was the one that was speaking of race. And I feel like that one is a pretty natural progression, right? You start by talking about how to have conversation, then you move into the ways in which we connect and what we're missing out on when we focus on things like work and productivity. And then you get to yet another thing that tends to divide us, and it's this completely invented thing known as race, this completely invented imaginary thing that has caused so much damage and heartache and suffering in the world. And how do we get through it? Because these difficult conversations that we have to have with one another, you can't get past them. You have to get through them. And so all of my work has been focused on these basic things. Who are we as human beings? How do we relate with one another? How do we find well-being? And how do we connect? How do we create the kind of empathic bonds that we require in order to survive? And, that brings us to this very moment in time, which is so fraught as we begin to recover from the COVID pandemic. And I say that with all due respect, because at this point, there's still hundreds of people dying of COVID every day. So not intending to downplay anyone's suffering or what anyone is going through. But as a society, as we begin to try to emerge from the pandemic, we're discovering that a lot of us really went through a tough time. And it's left imprints on us. It's possibly done damage. Worldwide, the WHO said that the COVID-19 pandemic caused a 25% increase in anxiety disorders and depression worldwide. In the United States, those numbers are even higher. And I mention that because when we are anxious and when we are depressed, it makes conversation more difficult. Because of course it does. We are a social species. And by that, I mean that in our day and age, most of the threats that you will encounter will not be, a lion chasing you. It will be a threat to your social standing. It will be a threat to your emotional well-being. But the thing of it is that our bodies and our brains react to those social threats almost exactly the same way we react to someone throwing a punch, meaning that our bodies go through the exact same things when someone says something to us that upsets us or insults us or offends us. Our body goes through that exact same process. The heart rate goes up, heart rate variability goes down. You begin to sweat, your muscles begin to contract. All of those things occur just as though you were being attacked and you needed to make a decision to fight or flee or freeze. Excuse me. So here we are as we try to recover from the pandemic, and so many of us are experiencing some level of trauma or anxiety. And that's going to make it difficult for us to talk to one another because we're all in this state of fight, flight, or freeze. And so if someone says something to us, not only are we much more sensitive to insult, or we're much more sensitive to what we perceive as threat, but we're also not very patient. I'm not saying this because I feel this. I'm saying this because this is what we know about neurology. This is what we know about the human system. When you're anxious, when you're depressed, it becomes more difficult to be compassionate, to be patient. You're much more likely to perceive other people as threats. You're much more sensitive to injury. And not only do we need to be aware of that for ourselves, but we need to be aware of it for each other and meet each other where we are. And sometimes that means we have to start these conversations by asking, what have you been through? What's it been like? How do you feel you've changed? What's happened? Tell me. Tell me about what the past couple of years have been, and I'll share my story too. And maybe we can be in this together. The next book that I'm working on is a book about self-compassion, which again, I see as a natural extension of the work I've been doing. But in the Western world, at least, self-compassion is an extremely unfamiliar and brand new field of study. And I say that because when you say in Western society, when you say compassion, we're almost always talking about the compassion we show or don't show to other people. We rarely think or consider the compassion we show or don't show to ourselves. And yet, as it turns out, self-compassion makes you more resilient than self-esteem. Self-compassion makes you more motivated to work on improvements and problem solve. Self-compassion extends into compassion for others as well, but it has to begin with you, with understanding what you've been through, being willing to talk about pain openly, without judgment, without suppressing it or running away from it. There's a saying in therapy that is, you can't heal what you don't feel. And at this moment, as we begin to try to not only help each other, but help ourselves recover, we need to remember that you cannot heal what you don't feel. And as we move forward through these conversations with one another, I encourage you to be present with whatever it is that you're feeling and not judge the emotions that you have. Emotions are not identity. The emotions that you feel are not who you are. If you feel angry, you're feeling angry. And angry is a valuable emotion, just like love is. There's no value judgment on those emotions. The only value judgment is on what you do with your behavior because of that emotion. So as you think about moving forward in the conversations that you're going to have, because some of them are going to be difficult, I want you to start with having a conversation with yourself. When you get into these moments of feeling frustrated or angry or overwhelmed or upset, that's a moment to stop and honestly recognize what that is. I'm feeling upset. Okay, this is what happens in my body. When I'm feeling upset, my shoulders start creeping up towards my ears. There's a muscle right in the back of my neck. I'm talking about me personally, that starts to tense up. Sometimes so much that I'll feel it like a twinge of pain back there. I furrow my brow, like I start getting this little wrinkle right here. Like, start to notice what that looks like and feels like in your body without judgment. Not, oh God, I shouldn't be feeling this way. Because you don't have any control over that. That's what you're feeling. Be present with that in the moment Acknowledge what you're feeling, and then say to yourself, may I be kind to myself? May I be peaceful? May I accept myself as I am? Have that conversation with yourself first. Just an honest accounting of what your emotion is. And as you start to become more aware and be present with yourself in that moment without judging, it actually makes you a lot more resilient to failure. The other component of self-compassion, and this is what makes it so important to human communication. Self-compassion can't exist without a sense of common humanity. And let me explain what I mean by this. One of the barriers to self-compassion is what's known as rumination and also self-pity. This is when we really focus in on all the bad things that are happening to us. We're ruminating on it. We're focusing in on, how could this happen to me? I don't know what to do. I'm lost. I'm stuck. This is awful. Why do these things keep happening to me? That's a combination of rumination and self-pity. And that's going to prevent you from moving on because you're focusing in on yourself. But what self-compassion asks you to do is, in that moment when you say, wow, I'm feeling really angry, I screwed up and I knew I shouldn't have done this and I did it again. That's the moment when you say, you know what? I bet at least 10,000 other people made the same mistake today. I'm feeling pain, and humans feel pain when this happens. Of course, I'm upset when my kid lies to me because that's what happens. Of course, you feel upset if somebody lies to you. Of course, you feel upset and frustrated if you get a flat tire. This is part of the human experience. This isn't just happening to me, this is happening to all of us. That sense of common humanity, that even your pain is something that you share with others, that's what lifts that experience out of self-pity and helps you actually, it lowers your cortisol, like by a lot. It lowers your stress response, not only your physiological stress response in terms of your tensing muscles, your breath rate, it lowers your neurological stress response. When you begin to feel kindness toward yourself, when you treat yourself the way you treat a loved one, if you can ask yourself in that moment, okay, I screwed this up, but if I were speaking to this other person that I love, would I tell them, my God, you're an idiot? What a moron. How could you do that? You did this last week and you knew you shouldn't do it again. Would you ever speak that way to your best friend? Of course you wouldn't. All that self-compassion asks you to do is to speak to yourself the way you speak to people that you love. I'm going to move on in just a second to talk about how to get through some of these difficult conversations. But it's really important to me at this moment in time, when we have so much dividing us, and yet our ability to heal, our ability to move forward and progress depends on our ability to make connections with one another. And frankly, we have found no relationship between whether you like somebody and whether you can work well with them. You don't have to like somebody to be able to work with them to collaboratively problem solve. Some of the biggest problems that we have in the world, climate change and racism and inequality and all of these other things, we're gonna have to solve them together because literally that's how our species works. And you don't have to like anybody to do that. Human beings work beautifully together and communicate beautifully together, even when they don't get along. So I know we have questions coming in and I'm going to get to all of them, but I want to talk about this particular issue, working together when you don't get along. There are so many examples of this all through history of people who have been able to overcome really phenomenal differences in order to solve big, big problems. And so I want to give you an idea about how to do that. And the first thing I want to say is that we know through brain scans that you literally cannot speak and listen at the same time because they require much of the same parts of the brain. So when it's the same part of the brain, that brain part of the brain can only be doing the one thing. It can either be speaking or it can be listening. And I say that because that includes all those times when someone else is speaking and you're thinking about what it is you're going to say. That's speaking and listening at the same time, and it can't be done. So if you're sitting there focused on what question you're going to ask, what you're going to say in response to what the other person is saying, you are not listening to them. So as you dive into these conversations that may be fraught, the most important thing that you can do is to actually hear what someone else is saying. It's probably one of the most urgent needs that any human being has, which is to be heard. We all want to be heard. You would be shocked at how often that simple act of really hearing somebody can get you so much further in a conversation. I've had conversations with, I'm Black and Jewish. I've had conversations with white supremacists. I've had conversations with people who absolutely do not respect my fight for equal rights as a female, as a Black person, as a Jewish person, but we've had a conversation. I don't have to agree with them. I'm not trying to convince them or change their minds, because that's not going to happen. You will not change somebody's mind over the course of a conversation. But you can have a true conversation, meaning you can have a mutual exchange of ideas if you can go into that conversation with authentic curiosity. To really listen to them because you think there might be something they have to tell you that you haven't heard before, or that they might be able to help you understand something that you didn't fully understand before. If you enter these conversations thinking, you know what, I bet there's something they know that I don't know, and I'm going to find out what that is. I don't have to, I'm always, and I'm never ever talking about a conversation in which you feel threatened or there's any form of abuse, harassment, of course. But most conversations are not like that. It's rare for somebody to actually get into conversation like that. We're talking about a conversation in which you disagree, and sometimes disagree about really important things. You have to ask yourself what your goal is. What is your goal in that conversation? Why have it? Because all too often we go into these conversations with those who disagree, trying to prove a point or score points or change their mind or win. And you cannot do any of those things. You will not accomplish those things. So that means you have to change your goal, right? Or there's no point in having the conversation. So if your goal is not to change their mind or educate them or score points, then maybe your goal can be, you know what? This person knows something I don't know. I'm going to listen to them. I'm going to hear them. And I'm not going to walk away from this conversation until I've learned something. Now, does that mean you have to be in a conversation where you're not heard? Of course not. A conversation is a mutual exchange of ideas. And any debate, any engagement on that level has to include intellectual honesty, but from both of you. The thing is that we've really lost sight of the value in that kind of conversation. We think that if we go on Google, we can do a quick search and be an expert in whatever the subject matter is. 80% of people don't even read articles, they just read the headlines. And so, you know, somebody has an opinion about something, and we have this vague sense that they're wrong. So we want to post about it on social media. We do a real quick Google search. We find an article that agrees with what we already believe. We skim through it really quick, and then we go and put our post in. That's not being an expert. That doesn't allow us to learn from other people's expertise. And I don't know what it's like for you, but there are so many people who think they know how to do my job better than I do. And I am sure that for you, it's as frustrating it is for me to have to say to someone, if 20 years experience in journalism doesn't count, then what are we all doing here? Either that 20 years of experience counts, making me an expert in my field, or there's no point in pretty much anything that we do. Of course, your years of experience in what you do is important. Of course, it makes you more informed, more experienced, more knowledgeable on the subject. But it goes both ways. It means the other person that you're talking to may very well be more knowledgeable, experienced, and informed on that subject. And we need to let each other be the experts that we are. We need to let other people know stuff that we don't know. We have to stop believing that a Google search makes us an expert, because that's making us incurious. It's making us smug. It's escalating conflict. And frankly, it's flattening our learning curve, or sometimes sending it straight down into the toilet. We're not learning from one another. And for Homo sapiens, that's how we learn, is from one another. I have about 3 minutes left, so I want to just wrap up with one more thought about difficult conversations. So let me tell you a story. Imagine you're in this scenario. Imagine that you hurt your knee. Not like you need to go to the emergency room, but you hurt it. It hurts. And you get sent to a specialist, an orthopedic surgeon, and it takes you forever to get an appointment with this guy. Like 2.5 months you have to wait for an appointment. And that whole 2.5 months, your knee is hurting you, right? It's not excruciating, but it hurts every day. And finally, you're like 2-3 days away from your appointment, and you get a call from his office and they reschedule. And you are so angry. And so, a couple weeks later or so, you finally get in to see the doctor, and you are prepared to tell him how inconsiderate that was. And he comes in the door and he says, "I'm so sorry for rescheduling your appointment. Thank you so much for your flexibility. The earthquake happened in Haiti, and I rushed down so I could get to the hospital there and maybe, help treat some of the people who'd been injured." And pretty much all of your anger evaporates, right? You no longer have a need to give that doctor, a piece of your mind. This is just an example of how much your perspectives can change when you get more information. It can completely change your emotional reaction to what has happened. It can completely change the principle of the matter, right? You're ready to argue the principle of the matter. And so there's a question that I want you to ask yourself before you attack someone else. When they say something that bothers you, when they take a stance that you think is awful, when they do something that upsets you and you think is wrong, I want you to ask yourself, what else could this mean? Is there something I'm not seeing here? Are there questions I need to ask? Because maybe I'm leaping to the worst possible interpretation of this a little too quickly. What else could this mean? Because we all need to kind of give each other the benefit of the doubt a little more. Survey after survey shows that in general, people are good. They're honest. They mostly tell the truth. They mostly follow the rules, follow the law, try to be good people. Most people are good. And I mean, most of them, a lot of them. People who are truly awful are pretty rare. That doesn't mean that all of us don't do things that hurt other people. We do. It doesn't mean we don't sometimes make selfish choices. I do. You do. But it means that at heart, most of us are doing our best in a life that is tough, and lately has been really tough. We are at 8:01, and we're going to go to questions. So yes, there you are.
All right. Yes, we've definitely had a few questions come in already. So let's see. Start with, do you have tips for handling conversations when depression and or anxiety are at their height?
Yes, there's a few things to remember, and it doesn't say whether your anxiety and depression is at their height or the other person's. So let me answer both versions.
Okay.
So if your depression and anxiety is at a height, the sometimes the tendency is to turtle. It's to sort of hide in your cave. And that can be okay on a very limited basis. And but it needs to be really used with caution. And I say that because social interaction, even if you just have a 90-second exchange with your grocery store clerk about the weather, it's actually very healing to you. It'll give you a boost of oxytocin and serotonin. It'll bring your mood up in a lasting way, in a way that lasts for hours. It actually helps to clear your mind and helps you see perspective much better. So if you are the one who is feeling very anxious, I would just say go for very small, short-lived conversations and get that social interaction. And even waving to someone on the street increases your feelings of belonging, which is a feeling that brings well-being, a sense of well-being. The other thing I would say is that one of the fastest ways to fight anxiety and depression, there's two of them. Looking at trees. In some cases, they have found it to be better than drugs at lifting depression. I'm not a doctor and I'm not advising anybody about their own prescriptions. I'm just saying that research has shown that being in nature and looking at nature can be extremely good for you in terms of lifting your mood. The other one is that helping other people, finding a way to help someone else, is also an almost immediate boost. They call it the helper's high. And they have found that even among patients who are suffering from cancer and are currently in chemotherapy, if they have a regular volunteer give, or they're doing something to help someone else, it boosts their moods by double digits. So that's number one. When you're in conversation with someone else, you want to make sure that you are, number one, open about it, and say, I'm happy to talk to you. If my temper is short, I'm just in an anxious place right now. It has anything to do with you. I do this with customer service people all the time. I'll get a customer service person on the phone and I'll be like, I've been on hold for an hour and a half. I'm pretty angry right now. And so just so you know, this isn't about you. I realize it's not your fault, but I'm mad. If you are talking to someone else who is in that place of anxiety, you don't need to probe into what's wrong with them. When you say, what's wrong? And someone's like, nothing. And you're like, I can tell something's wrong. Just tell me what's wrong, right? You don't need to probe. It's okay to just give them a feeling of safety. And the fastest way to do that is just to simply let them be heard and let them be completely accepted. One of the best ways to do that is if they do start telling you about things, refrain from offering advice of any kind. That's kind of a general tip for everything. But do not try to fix anything. Don't offer advice. Don't tell them what you did when you were in the same situation. Don't tell them that you were in a situation that was really similar and you were okay. Offer zero pieces of advice. Just be a witness.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. You kind of answered this one earlier, so maybe you could just say maybe your favorite tips or most reliable tips. Do you have any tips for practicing self-compassion?
Yeah, actually, yes. The thing of it is that, and this is very, very interesting, which is that self-compassion absolutely can be taught. And it's also what clinicians will call dose dependent, which means that the more that you practice self-compassionate exercises, the higher your self-compassion will go. You can actually go online and take a free quiz that's been clinically studied and proven to be pretty accurate on your level of self-compassion. So I would do that first, is find out what is your self-compassionate score. For most people, it's not great. So that means that every day you need to find an exercise that you can do in self-compassion. So, for example, they found in one study that people who wrote themselves a self-compassionate letter once a week actually felt a relief in depressive symptoms for 6 months. If they wrote once a week for 8 weeks, 8 weeks, they wrote one letter a week, and they felt less depressed for 6 months' time. And a self-compassionate letter is one that includes those three things: honesty about the present moment. What am I feeling? What am I going through? Common humanity. You know what? This is the human experience, right? Like, a lot of people have made this mistake before. And the final one is kindness and gentleness. Talking to yourself as though you were your best friend. Another thing that you can do, and this has a fancy name for it, it's the Gestalt technique, is start recognizing that voice that is so harsh inside your head, that voice that always has something crappy to say about who you are, what you're doing. You're never going to get that promotion. Oh my God, that was the dumbest joke ever. Nobody's laughing. That voice that's inside your head, start to recognize it. Give it a name if you have to. And now I want you to imagine, and it doesn't have to be a real person, but I want you to imagine the most nurturing person you know or could ever know. Like, who's the person who's on your side? Even if you have to like make them up using the best parts of a lot of people you know, imagine that person. That person who's always like, you know what? No, you're awesome. You are so awesome. And I want you to allow that nurturing person to reply to that crappy voice in your head. I want you to imagine how that dialogue goes. As soon as this crappy, critical, harsh, judgmental voice starts speaking, let the other voice be heard. You know what? You're right. Yeah, this was a huge screw up, and I've done it before, and I need to work on not doing this again, because obviously it causes all these problems. This is a moment of suffering for me. Like, this is painful. I'm upset. And I've been here before, and other people have been here before, and this happens. And this is the wrong time for me to be harsh to myself. Like, this is the worst possible time. I'm in a moment of suffering. What do I need? What do you need? You're gonna get through this. You got this. It's okay. I want you to imagine that dialogue. So those are just a couple things. I mean, there's all kinds of other stuff. If you like meditation, it's one of the best ways to do self-compassion. If you're doing compassion meditation or loving kindness meditation, but you can work on it and you can increase that score.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. This one goes into more relationship with other people. How can we combat the echo chamber we all end up in on social media and get a variety of sources?
You can't. And so the human brain does not interact with social media the way that it does with other people. It's just not the same. We know that. We have brain scans to prove it. Global. It's not just an American thing. When you are, and it's not just social media either. It's even in email. You are less compassionate. You're less likely to cooperate. You're more likely to escalate conflict. Social media pushes people out to the extreme polar sides of any opinion spectrum. So you can't have that conversation in a nuanced way pretty much ever over social media. Social media is very valuable in a number of ways, but they're limited. Social media is really great for information exchange. Like if I were to put out on Twitter, hey, I'm doing this event for Johnson County, Kansas tonight, that's a great way to spread the word on that, because people can share it and amplify it. And, you know, you can put a link in there where people can very, very quickly get engaged. I can put out links to any pieces that I write, interviews that I do. Great. I can share photos of my incredibly cute dog. But in terms of like having a human exchange in which it involves the executive functioning of our brains and our right temporal parietal junction, which is where most of our empathy and self-control is housed, that's not going to happen. So it's best to just understand the limits social media and not use it for the things that it doesn't do well.
Mhm. All right. Related to that, with people being polar opposites on opinions, how do we handle conversations with people who are not interested in listening?
I mean, if they're not interested in listening, you won't be able to have a conversation with them. Um, I would walk away. Sometimes if I'm feeling particularly catty, I'll say, I'm not feeling heard. I don't think, you don't seem to be in the headspace to be able to listen to me right now, which is okay. But I'm going to, let me know when we might be able to have this conversation. Otherwise, I just walk away. You can't, this question about how to change someone else's behavior is one of the most common that I get worldwide. And my answer is always the bad news is you cannot change anybody else's behavior. The good news is that human beings are primed to learn by modeling. Like we model our behavior on what other people do. If you got a new job and you showed up on the first day in a suit with leather shoes and everything, and everybody there was in cargo shorts and sandals, you would not show up the next day wearing a suit. You would immediately model your dress according to what everyone else does. We underestimate how powerful and influential that I want to say it's a talent, that skill is in human beings. Like we can walk into a room and immediately know whether it's a party or a funeral. Dogs can't do that. Like most species can't do that. A bird can't read the room. Human beings are really good at sensing, the emotional tenor of a space, of an environment, and the sort of expectations, and modeling our behavior on that. And I say all this because if this person who's not listening to you, if it's somebody that you're in a relationship with, either as a coworker or a loved one or whatever, if you begin to model really, really good conversational etiquette and conversational exchanges where you share the room, where you don't interrupt, most people will begin to model their behavior on yours.
Good to know. All right. So if you're trying to model that behavior, do you have any tips on how to self-regulate when you feel your emotions getting high in that conversation?
I mean, the first thing is to be totally honest about it. If I'm starting to get upset with something, I say, "Wow, I'm beginning to feel defensive. Give me a sec. Let me see if I can bring myself back down." There have been conversations, and I talk about this a lot in the book, Speaking of Race, of getting through those moments. There have been conversations where I've said, you know what, we're not going to agree on anything. So I'm going to play the three questions game with you, which means I'm going to ask you three questions, and I bet you by the time I ask them, I'll have found something we have in common. Like, let's just set that aside because we're not going to be able to talk about that in a healthy way. And it's always like tacos or, what's your favorite season? It's always something like that. Dogs are better than people. Always. But even those things, that kind of common ground can help heal over those really fraught moments. And it can bring down your cortisol level. There's also it's 8:15, so we have time. I want everyone to learn to do, if you don't know already, how to do a quick body scan, because this is another thing that you can do, and it just takes seconds. Okay, so we're all going to do this together. I want everyone to close your eyes, and I want you to just imagine that you're in a standing MRI, like you're in a machine that's scanning you from head to toe. And just imagine that the scan has begun, and it's just scanning slowly but steadily without ever stopping through your head. Keeps going. Maybe now it's down to your nose. And all you're doing is noticing what you find. You're not changing anything. You're not going to label it. You're just noticing. Are you clenching your jaw? Noted. Do your shoulders feel loose and good? Noted. Maybe you're down going through your chest now. Maybe you're down to your belly. What do you find? How does it feel? How does your body feel? What's your mood? Maybe you're down to your thighs. Down to your knees. Not changing anything. That's not the point. You're just taking note of what's there. And it's scanning through your shins, down to your ankles, and then scans all the way through your feet. I bet you feel a little calmer. And you weren't even in a moment of anxiety. Just taking that moment, 20 seconds, to just be present in your own body. Okay, what's happening to me right now? How am I feeling? Where's my breathing? Is it up here? Or is it down here? Are my shoulders going up? Am I clenching my fists? What's going on in my body? Just that few seconds of that can actually do a lot to bring your stress levels down.
Yes, that was excellent. I like that exercise a lot. All right. Is a possible barrier to self-compassion being viewed by others as selfish? And how might we get past that self-conscious barrier of trying to please others by avoiding appearance of being selfish when practicing acts of self-compassion?
So self-compassion, it's really common for people to think, oh, this is self-indulgence. It is the opposite of that, in fact. Self-compassion requires that you be fully honest about what's happening, about mistakes you've made, about what's going on, about just being absolutely honest about what's happening to you right in that moment and what you're experiencing. It's not selfish because in the end, self-compassion makes you, like I said, more resilient. It also makes you much more likely to be motivated to make positive changes. We think that tough love is motivating, and it is absolutely the opposite. And we've known that for a very long time. Like any psychologist or organization or behavioral scientist will tell you, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. The pain and the trauma that you go through does not make you stronger. It doesn't. Like that whole no pain, no gain thing, that is complete crap. So this idea that you have to be tough on yourself or somehow you'll become lazy and unmotivated and won't do things, it's just not true. It's understandable that you think that, because that is what our culture has been telling us for literally generations. Like we're children and we can't be trusted at all, right? Like parents hesitate to praise their kids because then they think they aren't going to try anymore. It's not true. The people who are the most self-compassionate and therefore the most resilient to failure, the most likely to recover when they have failed, are the people whose parents were the most compassionate to them, the ones who were kind. The ones who, when they came home and they had failed a class, didn't say, how could you do this? This is awful. You're grounded from everything, blah, 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 blah. It's the parents who said, wow, that blows. Obviously, failing is not great. Everybody fails a class. Almost everybody fails a class now and then. Like, we don't want to have that happen again. How can I help you? How can I help you as you move forward? What is your plan? What do you think? That kid is way more likely to actually be able to get back up on their feet when they fall down in the future. So this idea that self-compassion is selfish, completely wrong-headed. And you're not talking about like treat yourself. That's not what self-compassion is at all. This idea of self-care, it's fine as far as it goes, but that self-care is not self-compassion. Self-esteem is not self-compassion. Self-esteem can go toxic really, really quickly. Self-esteem is going to help you feel good about yourself. Self-compassion is what protects you when things go wrong. So, self-compassion also tends to eventually grow into compassion for others as well. So it's literally the opposite of selfishness.
All right, thank you for that distinction. We've reached the last question in my audience question queue. So if you have a burning question, please submit it now. I'll highlight the Q&A on your screen. So this goes back to what you were saying about not bringing the conversation back to your experience when listening, doing active listening. So how do we build relationship if we're not relating what's being said to our own lives? How do we have that moment of sharing?
Yeah, you can relate what's being said to your own life in your own head. That's okay to think those thoughts to yourself. The thing is that when we say things like, oh, I've been through some, that happened to me too, or whatever, I know how you feel, which is never, ever, ever true. We think we're expressing empathy to someone else. We think that's building a relationship. And the truth is that it's not. It's doing the opposite of that. Charles Derber, a sociologist, used to call this conversational narcissism, which is just his way of saying that human beings are very skilled at bringing conversations back to the subject that we're most familiar with and that we know best, which is ourselves and our own experience. And so someone says, oh God, my dog died. And we say, oh man, my dog died a couple of years ago. It was so terrible. I'm so sorry. It took me forever to get over it. And we think we're expressing empathy with them. But we know that in that other person's brain, that's not interpreted as empathy. That's interpreted as us turning the attention back to us and our story. In fact, it's often interpreted for them, both mentally and emotionally, as they need to then soothe you and express their sorrow over your experience. So in order to build relationships, the number one way to build a relationship with someone else is to listen to them. And I'm not worried that you're only going to listen and not talk because the balance is so far the other way right now that it's okay. You can really lean into that listening portion and you will still be okay. We all talk. We, from birth, are very good at talking. We're not great at listening. And that's not necessarily the fault of our technological devices. It has been difficult for human beings to listen for as long as we've been studying it. It's hard. It requires focus and attention and energy. And so that's the part that you really have to work on. It's so ironic to me that we have all these schools that offer public speaking courses and zero offer lessons in listening, because listening is the harder activity.
All right. Oh, one more question. Do you have tips to work on listening?
Yeah, in fact, there was a really great longitudinal study, meaning took a long time, done in Australia and New Zealand, in which they tried to improve the listening skills of several schools of kids. And what they found is that you really do have to practice it the way that you'd practice learning Spanish or the way that you'd go to the gym on a regular basis. Like you need to choose what exercise that you want to focus in on and then really work on it. You're not going to leave this talk and be like, I'm going to be a better listener from now on. And that's not how that works. So one of the things that you can do is, mindfulness is always going to help you. And I say that because like when you are learning to be mindful, let's say that you do a 5-minute meditation every day. Essentially, all that they're going to train you to do is to pay attention to your breathing. And they're going to say, okay, watch yourself breathe out, watch yourself breathe in. And when thoughts come into your head, because they will, just without judging it, without resisting it, just say, oh, there's a thought, and then just let it go. Imagine yourself just letting it go. And then return your attention to your breath. Now, this is important in conversation and in listening because while you were talking to someone else, your brain continues to think. It continues to supply you with information. It's like, CNN at the airport. It's like always on in the background. And so you're not going to be able to empty your head. All that you need to learn and train yourself how to do is to let your brain continue to supply with the information without becoming distracted by it, without following that thought until you're off in another world, but say, okay, yeah, thank you, and then return to what the other person is saying. And that is an extremely good exercise when it comes to listening, because frankly, that's one of the most difficult things for people to do. Another thing that you can do, and then when I work with like as an executive coach for people, I have them choose an object, which is similar to when Indigenous people use a talking stick. Do not get a talking stick. Don't appropriate that particular sacred object, but you can choose an object, whether it's a tennis ball or anything else at all, that the person who's speaking has the stick. And so when they're ready to talk, you say, oh, let me hand this over to you. This is going to help you in a number of ways. Not only is it going to help your turn taking, but it's going to help you to be more thoughtful about the back and forth of a conversation. And if it looks like they're super anxious to say something, instead of continuing to talk, and sometimes we'll get louder so that we can finish what we're saying, you can be generous about it. And oh, look, it's like you're getting really, let me give you this. Let me give you the tennis ball. Obviously you really want to jump in here. Go ahead. And that can be a physical manifestation of the turn taking that also is quite difficult when you're listening.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We are out of questions and out of time. So do you have any last minute thoughts to leave us with?
Yeah, I would say it's really common right now for people to stop talking to people in their lives because they disagree. And what ends up happening because of that is not only do you lose a relationship that's probably going to be valuable to you in some way. Again, I'm not talking about relationships that involve any kind of abuse or trauma, but not only are you losing that relationship, but you're ending up putting yourself in a situation where you're only going to be talking to people who agree with you already. And those people are already self-selecting information that reaffirms what they already believe. So you're surrounding yourself with people who are full in confirmation bias, and it doesn't matter how smart they are. In fact, the smarter you are, the higher your IQ, the more vulnerable you are to bias than others. You're missing out. The point is not to avoid talking to those people. It's to up your skills. Up your skills so that you can talk to them without getting into an argument. That's how you get through that. So stop canceling all your holiday dinners. Go have the holiday dinner and just learn how to get through the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation and for those tips that I know I will be using. I'm sure others will be too. Also, thank you to the Johnson County Library staff who helped make this program possible. Our next Community Matters program, Civics 101, Election Security, will be on Tuesday, October 18th, here on 24. You can find registration for that on our website. We also have an in-person Gather at the Table event on Tuesday, November 15th at the Central Resource Library. This is a come and go event and no registration is required, so we hope to see you there. Thank you so much for attending our program today, and we hope to see you all again soon.